My name is Ashleigh Gordon, and I am Artistic and Executive Director, as well as violist for Castle of Our Skins. I will be your moderator, as I have the mic, as you can see, for today's panel. And today, we will be discussing two related topics that continue to be backbone of really all of our work, and that is research and research-inspired programming. With my fellow panelists here, we will discuss how in this age of instant culture and Ask Google Anything, we can use the myriad composer databases, many of which appeared post-2020, online resources and archival materials that exist to truly humanize and provide full narratives of composers and build impactful programming. So with me, I'll give brief words, and full bios are on Hopin. Everyone has websites. You can research and engage with us afterwards as well. But with me are Dr. Laura Colgate, co-founder, artistic and executive director of Boulanger Initiative, an organization that promotes women and all gender marginalized composers through performance, education, research, consulting, and commissions. Dr. Leah Claiborne, a pianist and educator, yes, who promotes diversity in the arts by championing piano music by Black composers in her performances, research, and teaching. And then Dr. Melanie Zeck, a reference librarian at the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center, former reference librarian at the Center for Black Music Research, and former managing editor of the Black Music Research Journal. For framing, as we will touch on research in both physical and digital spaces, I'd actually love to start with you, Melanie. So can you share with us what materials, in sort of broad and as specific ways as you would like, can be found in archives, and perhaps any surprises, connections, stories that you were able to come across in your own research?
Thank you, and good morning. It's never too early for research. I do research all day, every day, and I probably dream about it too. Libraries are endlessly fascinating, and as someone who lived in Chicago for 20 years, I know what it's like for informational immediacy, because when I want a Chicago pizza, I want it now. And a lot of the things that we have available to us now in terms of our phones and computers, we want what we want when we want it, possibly 5 minutes ago or yesterday. So in libraries, we are constantly competing against the human impulse for informational immediacy. But what's so valuable about a library and archives, and sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes the archive is separate from the library, but you can always come to expect 4 specific types of resources at the library: primary resources, secondary resources, sonic resources, and my personal favorite, reference resources. Now, the primary resources, those are typically considered part of the archive itself. And for those of you who have had the opportunity to use archives, you know that those materials include anything from note cards, handwritten documents, sometimes napkins. I know I was at an archive one time at Evanston at Northwestern University where there were realia, which could be anything from Fritz Reiner's ashtray or desk to just items that are of important realia, things in real life, ephemera. And what is so valuable about those is they help to tell the story behind the story. I think today with this informational immediacy, we think that just popping online or popping onto a database is the be-all, end-all, that you can find the answer to what I call the quantitative interrogatives: the who, the what, the when, and the where. But the fun part, the real meat of the matter in the research, is the how and the why. But that's not all. When you look at a primary resource, and trust me, where there's me, there's many, many librarians and archivists who want to work with you individually, with your group, your family, and community to ensure that you have the research skills that you need to maximize your potential, capitalize on your interests, and really unpack the story behind the story. So we offer all sorts of ways that you can take a primary source, or you can take a piece that you're interested in, some sort of sonic phenomenon, and cross-reference using all 4 types of resources to get a sense of the landscape of a particular practitioner or composer. the types of ideologies, socio-political, geographical, contextual, undergirding ideologies that help make a piece what it was, to really understand how a musical document or a musical genre, style, tradition, or practice came to be. Because each of these types of resources and the representatives thereof, that's just one thing. But there are people who are working tirelessly with those of you who are musicians, administrators, just curious folks, to amplify what has been collected and preserved. And these databases that are going to be shared with you today, they represent thousands of hours of research. And there is so much left to be done. Some of you may read the New York Times. Can I see a show of hands? Anybody see the New York Times? 3 weeks ago, there was an article about Vicente Lusitano. That article is about a composer who was born about 500 years ago. He's Afro-Portuguese, and he worked at the Vatican, was a composer of motets and madrigals, and of course working in this Catholic venue. But toward the end of his life in the late 1550s and early 1560s, he converted to Lutheranism and moved north to what is now Germany. It took many, many people over an extraordinarily wide swath of time to get Vicente Lusitano as a marginalized, in some cases omitted from the mainstream musical and religious discourse, despite the fact of his prominence, relevance, and longitudinal viability, to be reintroduced, rediscovered, uncovered, and infused into the New York Times discourse, where people can finally say, wow, that's really interesting. Pause, pause, pause. I want to learn more. And the four of us have committed our lives, and many of you know my colleagues' work, but remember, behind this, the output, the intellectual output, represents musicologists, performing musicians, librarians, people who are interested in history, preserving the truth, rediscovering the truth, and infusing it, most importantly, into the discourse that is given to all of us at all ages. I have to tell you, it is never too early to do research. It is also never too late to do research. We practice so hard. I'm a bassoonist. I see a bassoonist right in front of me. We practice, that's right. And he also believes it's never too early to do research. We practice so hard with dexterity, accuracy of ear training when we're young, that I will tell you that at the Library of Congress, I'm currently supporting researchers, are you ready for this? Between the ages of junior high or so to 107 and a half years old. It is never too early, it is never too late. And remember, if you have a question, big or small, if this is new to you, we're here to support you from wherever you are to wherever you want to be, because we're at a critical juncture in research, performance, and the intersection thereof. Let's do this together.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, please. And as examples of some of those hours and hours and hours and communitarian efforts for research, I would love to talk about both of your culturally specific databases. So with Laura, Boulanger Initiative, and with Leah, Ebony Music. So can you share, and with all of us, both online and in person, what those databases are, and also how and why you created them?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a violinist. First and foremost, I see myself as a performer. And I did my dissertation on women composers and the frustration that went into finding every single piece, not just the score and the parts, but the lack of recordings out there. Where does the manuscript exist, if we know where it exists? Has this even been published before? The hours and hours and hours that goes just into finding the pieces. And then beyond that, trying to find any resources on the composer's life itself. If a woman was even well known in her own day, say in the 1800s, it's most likely that she's completely fallen out of history now, that we're not learning about her or playing her music. And most likely there hasn't been a lot of research into her life, and now we're having to catch up and do that. So for me to be able to pull those resources together and really focus on the historical composers, to be able to take every component of a piece. So our database is called the Women and Gender Marginalized Composers Repertoire Database. And it will be launching in March. And at this point, we have close to 10,000 pieces of repertoire in there, by about 1,600 historical non-living composers. So to be able to uncover where that manuscript exists, if we know who published it in the past and who's publishing it now, if they are, because many times they used to and they're not anymore, and we have a hard time getting our hands on those. If it has been recorded, or if it's easily accessible online. For that first step to be that easy, to have that at your fingertips, then we all have that time to go and really learn about the composer and the piece and spend the time performing it and studying it and contextualizing it, which a lot of times we just don't get the time to do as performers anyway, and educators. So as soon as it launches, we will let living composers opt in. So they will all give their consent to be a part of the database and be represented how they want to be represented, if they want to be a part of it. And we'll be able to make sure that their information stays accurate and up to date and all of that. So once it launches, it should exponentially grow overnight. But really if I had had this available when I had been doing my dissertation research, I could have gone so much farther in my research and done so much more. So for us to be able to pull this team together and over the last 3.5 years, build a resource like this will take us so much further in the future.
It's amazing. It's absolutely, I'm amazed by my colleagues up here. I want to tell everyone first that I never thought of myself as a researcher. I still don't think of myself as a researcher. And I say that to perhaps some of you all in the audience too. The term researcher, I think of Melanie, and I think of Laura, and I think of that. I think of all of you. But I want to tell you a little bit about why I never considered myself a researcher, and then which led to Ebony Music, which is I was at University of Michigan. I am first and foremost a pianist and piano teacher. That is my passion, my heart. And like Laura, I was doing my dissertation work on piano music by Black composers. So I had never been to an archival library. That's right, Melanie. So I said, well, here I am in Michigan. Let me go to Chicago. Let me take one of many, many trips. Let me go to Chicago, the Center of Black Music Research, and let me see what I find. That was my framework. So I go there, and I was like, okay, there's one composer who I will always reference, who is Irene Britton Smith. And I said, well, I don't know anything about her. I said, can I see what you have on Irene Britton Smith? And I think it was Janet at the time. I think it was Janet. She said, well, what years and what boxes do you want? Totally over my head, right? So what I realized is that time and time again, because you can't take one visit to an archival library. You just cannot do it. So I realized that it wasn't about, am I going to be able to find music for this dissertation? The problem was, there's too much. And I say that in the most beautiful way, right? There's too much music by Black composers for a dissertation that I wanted to do. So then you get the other issue that you have to realize is, my God, there's so much music that's not being utilized. And I've had a change of heart, but for a while, these archival libraries for me represented these graveyards in a way. And I say graveyard because these are people's lives in music, in their storylines, in literally physical evidence of who they were. And that's the part I love the most, the touching of scores and the revisions and the letters from teachers and poems or side notes. I live for that part. But we don't hear about that. And more than that, we don't even hear about their music. We don't even hear about their lives. And that's why I was like, gosh, this is heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking for a while for me to be at these archival libraries. Long story short, I realized I needed to frame the work differently, or I needed to have a frame or structure. And like I said, first and foremost, I'm an educator. I love teaching. And what I knew that I could do well is teach. And specifically in piano pedagogy, we have this leveling system. Essentially, from 1 to 10, at any point in time, I know what the standard repertoire for a level 3 student would be, right? Or for a level 7 student. So I thought to myself, what if we started framing piano music by Black composers in that light? So that at any point in time, a teacher can say, okay, I have a level 4 student. This is the piece by Nathaniel Dett. This is the piece by William Grant Still. This is the piece by Florence Price. This is the piece by Irene Smith that I could give a student at that level. So that at any point in time, a person like myself, going 30-some years, 20-some years at the time, would never have to be at a point where I was not aware that there was too much music not being utilized. So once I got that framework, I started writing my dissertation. I came to this other point when I realized, besides my committee, one person on my committee who's here, besides my committee, and maybe my mom and dad, no one's gonna read my dissertation. I mean, you put all these hours, but I really don't think no one's gonna do that. So then you're kind of left with, you're spending all these hours. And then I thought, okay, what's the point here? Why am I really doing this? And the other point for me was that while I was at Michigan, I also had a program specifically for Black youth. I wanted to teach Black youth, and I wanted to teach them this music in these archival libraries, to bring it to the forefront for them, to say, yes, you have a place, and it's normal to study classical music, and here are a wave of people before you who look like you, who have been studying this music as well, who have actually written music for you, with you in mind. So that made me feel better about my dissertation. You don't have to read it, and that's okay. That's okay. And in the same way, a little bit like a database, the databases are fine. I don't want to ever say anything wrong with database. But we have the resources now, and we have the action, and we have to have the will to go beyond saying we understand the numbers. We know we're past that. We know there's so much. I don't want to keep saying too much. There's so much. But what are you going to do with that information? Are you teaching it? And are you teaching it in a way that you would talk about Beethoven and Brahms? The way you're going to say, oh, Beethoven did 5 revisions of this, or we have different editions of that. Are you talking about Nathaniel Dett in the same way? And are you teaching it in that same type of integrity? So that became my framework for Ebony Music. It really just launched about 2 years ago, but I'm sure like with all of us here, it's a long process. And it's a process that didn't start here. It didn't start during the time of George Floyd. This started hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And none of us here, with any database, with anything that we can reference, it didn't start with us. We are referencing so many of hundreds of years of research that has gone into the field so that we can be at Sphinx and talk about it in this way.
Thank you. I'm hearing wonderment. I'm hearing curiosity, multiple rabbit holes that overlap and take you in places where you have no idea that you're entering and no idea where you'll exit. And then I also heard the sort of supplemental way of being able to build around resources and research. And that sort of brings me into something that you had alluded to, some of the maybe challenges and problems with maybe too much information or a consolidation of information or informational immediacy. I think you had used this term, yeah. So archives and databases, to your point, Leah, they're not new, all of this information, this consolidation of information. But I have definitely seen in my my work and my teaching with colleagues, 2020, an ad nauseum number of top 10 lists and databases and spreadsheets with multiple tabs, and not to discourage or discredit any of these, but the application, the usage, I found interchangeable line number 27 with line number 77, therefore my research is done, sort of quick fixes with this information overload that we have with these databases and the immediacy of information. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about some of the misuses, some of the challenges and problems that maybe easy access to information might have, stunting that interest and wonderment and curiosity to even go further. And I would love to start with you, since you have a database that you use and will be launching, and what are your thoughts around the application of information, and really for all of you, the application of information?
The first thing that always comes up is Women's History Month, that, you know, all of a sudden, 1 month a year, everybody's doing a concert of all women's music. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's, you know, you're looking at a lot of these orchestras now who take one concert out of the year and play an entire program of music by women. And to be able to take this database and so many searchable items to say, okay, we know that we are playing said piece. This is the instrumentation that we have on stage. What pieces exists between 12 and 17 minutes for these same instruments or less from the same period, or from France, taking the same country as the composer, and be able to really find a wealth of different pieces that you can put in there, so that we're not just playing 4-minute pieces by women on programs, and we're not just doing Florence Price over and over again, and allowing all of it to sit on those composers' shoulders who we have uncovered, but to really be going into the work of my co-founder, Joy Leilani Garbett, who's an organist and researcher. She did a Fulbright in France, and she ended up going to schools in Paris Conservatory, looking through class lists, trying to figure out which of these women were able to sneak into class, using a pseudonym sometimes. We'd have to figure out what names they would use to get into the class, because women weren't allowed to go to composition classes. They weren't allowed to create, only to recreate. And to figure out who snuck in there, and then who are their next of kin? Can we get into their granddaughter's attic and look through and see if we can find any manuscripts? And to take it as far as possible, to try to uncover some of these historical composers that have just completely been wiped out of history. So I think to go from doing no research, only programming one concert a year, to how far can we take our curiosity, and not just to let it be, okay, we're gonna play the music and then we're done with it, that's it, it's going away, but to make sure that we're actually engaging and contextualizing and turning them into humans instead of just notes on a page.
Yes, I completely agree with Laura, and I want to piggyback off of that, which is, I said earlier that I used to think of archival libraries as these graveyards, and then I had a change of heart the more I kept going to different ones, because it went from a graveyard to these treasure chests, right? And I say that because the issue or challenge, right, with a database is, if you all were to imagine 100 years from now, right, just stay with me for a second, if 100 years from now and someone took a snapshot of this room right now, and they said, I want to do a project or report on everyone's life here in this moment now. Okay, I'm sure by then we'll have robots to do all of this. But when you do that, what is the database going to do about everyone in this room? What we would end up with, okay, we have X amount of women, we have X amount of men, we have X amount of black, X amount of white, we have a number, we have a birthday, we had this person wrote 5 pieces, this person wrote 10 pieces, this is published, this is not published. Great. And that's the database. And so there is value in the collection of material, right? There's huge value of that. And it's needed, and it stamps a time and a place, and that's what we need, but that's the starting point. That's the starting point. Then it takes us as the performers and as the teachers and the educators, it takes us to, whether it's on stage or whatever capacity, to then say, this is an individual, and this is a story, and this is a life, and this is something that needs to be told because it's part of a collective, right? So that's what, that's the challenge, but it's the beauty, right? So I would just say with anyone, when you are doing your researcher, because whether you know it or not, you are a researcher. If you have a curious mind, you are a researcher. When you dive into these databases, you are entering the very, very first stage. And I would even say, don't go if you only want to look for numbers. Maybe look, okay, yeah, look for numbers, but do more. Do more than that, okay? Just know that you're on stage 1 of it. So the database, it's a beauty. It's great to have numbers and collection, but it's a great, great challenge because so much is lost, which is, as you said, the humanity and the life behind that person.
If I were to just add quickly to that, I think even if you don't identify as a researcher, I would hope that we all identify as storytellers, as conveners of information, of knowledge, through our instruments, through our words, through our actions, through our program notes, through our public presence, through the curation of our programming, whether you're an administrator, an educator, an academic, or whatever. And so the idea of being able to consolidate someone's life to a line item, someone's entire existence to a 0.25 second Google search doesn't make sense to me. And I think it doesn't make sense to us, and hopefully to us in the room and online. So having a entry point to be able to at least find some information to then dig deeper, the invitation to dig deeper is, I think, missed sometimes. I'm not rapping on your database, but missed sometimes in databases that people can't opt into and are already labeled. I was thinking of Tanya Leone, who who declined an offer to be included in Helen Walker Hill's From Spirituals to Symphony, which is a compilation of Black women composers. She didn't want to be labeled as such, and yet she may appear on various databases without consent. So I appreciate your opt-in attitude around this, where there is conversation, where there is an idea of self-identification as opposed to being supplanted on someone. In any case, Melanie, I would love to hear your thoughts around databases and perhaps challenges of use and or misuse before we get into how we can and should think about our research.
There's so many ways that I can respond. And I think I'm going to tell you about a time I was sitting on the reference desk and I got a phone call. This was in Chicago at the Center for Black Music Research. Woman says she's in her 70s, I believe at the time. She and her twin sister had taken music lessons at a young age with a woman named Ms. Rose, Muriel Rose. And did I have any information? And that she and her sister and 2 other lady friends grew up presumably on the southern part of Chicago, on the south side, and really just wanted to revisit the life of their lovely music teacher. And I had never heard of Muriel Rose, and I checked my files, I did a quick search, and I didn't find anything. And I was in error. I had made as I will tell you that I made a mistake. And I said, I'm sorry, I can get back to you. Let me see what I can find. So I started thinking about those quantitative interrogatives, the who, the what, the when, and the where, because my go-to sources, the reference resources, didn't have Muriel Rose listed. So I thought, well, who is this woman? Okay, we know she's a woman. I'm thinking about who posed the question. A woman. Operating where? Somewhere along the south side of Chicago. So for those of you that know Chicago, you know that it's a grid. Anything below 1200 south becomes the south side. There's certain pockets and certain neighborhoods. And I understand that this woman, Ms. Rose, was operating somewhere around Bronzeville, which those of you who may be familiar with the Chicago flowering of the Negro Renaissance know that down on King Drive, which is what it's called now, just 400 East, there's a lot of musical activity. Ding, ding, ding. So I started thinking, well, where am I going to go with this? I thought, well, it's not going to hurt to get a map. I need to reorient myself. This woman is calling me, and she's in her 70s. Let's backtrack. When was Ms. Rose operating? So now I've got a when, I've got a where, but what was Ms. Rose doing? Well, she was teaching, she was performing, and she was inspiring. So now I've got 4 hooks. I've got a who, I've got a what, I've got a when, and a where. But they wanted to know really about Ms. Rose. They wanted to unpack her life. They wanted to dive more deeply. And my resources at the time, you know, I did my go-to, I did my due diligence. But when I started thinking more critically about where Ms. Rose was anchored as a person in a socio-political environment, the geographical environment of Chicago, in the musical milieu of Chicago, I started realizing I was doing the research in the wrong way. I thought, well, who else is operating at this time? Now, as you know, over the last 12 years, Florence Price has really emerged in common parlance. But did you know that there are no fewer than 13 dissertations spanning multiple decades on Florence Price? There are many, many. She never really fell out of favor in the traditional sense. She just wasn't infused into that mainstream discourse, but there were people interested in her life and her productivity. So I wondered, well, what happened to Ms. Rose? Would you believe it? I went into my files on Florence Price, and Muriel Rose, turn the page. Muriel Rose, turn the page. Muriel Rose, turn the page. Muriel Rose was sitting in my office, in my files, but I had never approached the research question through the lens I needed to have employed to help this patron. Turns out, if you ever have a lot of free time on your hands, remember, I do this for a living. Do you realize Muriel Rose's life was illustrated week by week by week? Who she was teaching, what she was doing, where she was going in the Chicago Defender. Now, let's also keep in mind, back in the day, the Chicago Defender, of course, it's a paper newspaper. It's, you know, a thing that you touch. But it was eventually microfilmed, which if you ever get a bad microfilm machine, it messes with your eyes. But over time, since I've been doing this kind of research, we now have databases that enable you to read cover to cover the Chicago Defender and figure out it wasn't just Muriel Rose who was living in this area near Florence Price, near Margaret Bonds. There was Nanny Strayhorn Reed, who I believe it was her descendant, Cheryl Wall, who was a professor of English. She passed during the pandemic, unfortunately. She found manuscripts that Nanny Strayhorn Reed had, I don't know if it was the attic per se, but in her collection, that were written by Florence Price. So it wasn't just one person, Muriel Rose. I started seeing this network of activity. So through the lens of I'm looking for my teacher. I have such fond memories. I started realizing what was going on at 3000 South in Chicago and 3500 South in Chicago and a little further east and a little further west. I started thinking about all the primary resources at my disposal and how they mapped over and under and through my understanding of the Harlem Renaissance, which dovetailed into the Chicago flowering, and then emerged mid-century into something totally different in musicology. And I could talk all day about how music historiography has gone from the early part of the 20th century through the efforts of the Victor Talking Machine Company. Their educational efforts were what one would call at that time multicultural and global and holistic, to a downfall in the McCarthy era following World War II, where musicology was very Germanic, very European. And then you have this emergence, like Vicente Lusitano was first featured, I believe, in the Journal of the American Musicological Society in 1962. But it took until 2023 to reinfuse him into the New York Times. So this activity of giving people starting points, like, hi, I'm looking for my teacher, or hello, I'd like to find a piece that was written in France at a particular time. What I think you're really going to enjoy, I certainly do hope so, is that in our handouts that you're going to see later, you're going to see this research methodology lined out. Because it doesn't matter who or what or where or when you're starting from. The fact is you're starting, and that this can cut through the informational red tape, spark your creativity, and give you the tools, the pathways to amplify any type of musical project that's in your purview. And remember, yes, you've got these archival materials to unpack. Yes, you can read about how these people have been portrayed in biographies and articles and dissertations over time. Yes, you can then review these materials with the original maps, the original newspapers, additional reference resources. Was Muriel Rose included? Maybe. Why not ask the question, why not? If Florence Price was. You've got a lot of questions you can ask over and over to get to where you want to be with this understanding. And let's not forget those sonic resources. What about the historical recordings? What about field recordings? Yesterday I fielded, no pun intended, I addressed no fewer than 5 questions over the course of my day yesterday about Zora Neale Hurston. Now you'll find at the Library of Congress where I'm working now, we have field recordings. Well, what does that even mean? It means that they're not done in a studio. They're not done in a hall. They're done out and about. But we also have old radio recordings, and incidentally, we have recordings of William Grant Still, Nathaniel Dett, and William Levi Dawson, who appeared on the radio through CBS back in 1940. Those aren't in the music division of the Library of Congress. They're with us in Folklife. So yes, you might start with music, absolutely, but be thinking about your allied disciplines. Be thinking about your human resources who can help guide you on your path. I'm looking out into the audience, and I'm seeing people who've been active in this type of work for decades. We are here, and we are so eager to learn from you about what you're interested in and how we can get you to the next step. And don't be afraid to ask. We all started out with the Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms model. All of us. Is that correct? All of us. Well, as a bassoonist, I also included Hummel and Weber. So, and did you know in Bratislava there's an image of the Hummelian cult? Yeah, there were people who actually were interested in Hummel to that extent. But why not? I know. Trust me, and I know. But why not tap into the resources of the people I'm seeing in the audience and up here and ask us, how'd you do that? Well, who did you learn from? Well, what made sense to you? Because we're never going to stop doing this. In 5 years, 100 years, I won't be alive, but I mean, how are we going to change and infuse these databases and amplify them? I mean, it's really fun to to do this kind of work. But today is the day. If you haven't started, today's the day.
And on that note, I had one other question that was, I think, amazing, but I hope you all have amazing questions both in person as well as online. So if anyone would like to approach the microphone who is here with us in person, or if there's a question from Hopin, we can start a little bit of a Q&A session.
Hi, good morning. Is this thing on? Hi, I'm Rachel Barton Pine. My organization, musicbyblackcomposers.org, has been in operation since 2001. We started with the wonderful collaboration from the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago with the late, great Dominique Delerma, and Mark Clegg here from UM is now our main head advisor, whatever, chief advisor, something like that. Anyway, I wanted to just, first of all, make sure that everybody in the room knows about our website, musicbyblackcomposers.org, because in research, there's no such thing as competition. Like, we're there to amplify each other. We at NBC are doing lots and lots of primary research, but we also aspire to serve as a hub to increase awareness of everything that everybody else is doing. And so I wanted to just say two things. First of all, whatever books, dissertations, by the way, I read people's dissertations. And any URLs that you have that would be appropriate for us to add to all of our lists of resources, please, please, please let us know. And then also anything you're working on, first of all, so that we can help you. We have, last time I counted was 6 years ago, we had 900 pieces by 450 Black composers from 4 centuries and all around the planet. It's grown plenty since then. We might have stuff you're looking for already. We might be able to connect you with the appropriate researchers or archivists who can help you in your work. And also, if you're doing work that we have on our to-do list, but you're already doing it, then we can move on to something else. No point in duplicating efforts. The other thing I wanted to mention is volunteers. We're operating on a shoestring because somehow our niche is not eligible for most funding. Another conversation, but we rely on the generosity of volunteers as well as our paid researchers for so many things, whether it's doing Google searches, entering things into databases, typing stuff from sloppy manuscripts into Finale, getting things loaded up onto IMSLP if they're in the public domain. There's so much work to do. We have a huge list of tasks that volunteers could help us with. So I would love to get more volunteers, but also I'm sure that a lot of your projects up here and in the audience, maybe some of you could use volunteers, and we would love to serve as a hub for that, so that when somebody says, I want to help, how can I help? Instead of just giving somebody from my to-do list, I could say, well, so-and-so needs a volunteer. Why don't you volunteer for them? So that's another thing that we'd love to be more collaborative about. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is the issue of publishing. Florence Price, of course, has become suddenly, this huge topic of conversation, and yet the publisher, and I don't mind calling them out publicly, I'm trying to do so as much as I can. Schirmer is doing an absolutely horrendous job of getting her music to the public, rife with misprints, completely not following best practices, or I don't even know what practice. Are they doing any practice? I don't know what they're doing. Her violin concertos, for example, have 4 versions of the violin line, the one from the full score and its separate violin part, the one from the piano score, which might be a short score or might be a reduction. We're not sure yet of the progress of her compositional process. But that violin line and its separate violin part, 4 different versions of the violin part. Her violin concertos are published by Schirmer. There are no end notes talking about discrepancies between the sources. There are plenty of misprints where things are in the published score that don't correspond to any of the sources due to sheer sloppiness. This is a travesty. If a new archive of Mozart or Beethoven or Brahms had been brought forward into the world, you would not see this type of sloppiness. It's clearly still operating in the realm of discrimination or just capitalism. I mean, they've got the monopoly, and why bother to do a good job? You have to buy it anyway. So it might just be capitalism. But in any case, you're seeing the same thing with the publisher that's bringing out Samuel Coleridge Taylor's work. So I feel like we as researchers, not only doing our research, but also doing what we can to call out those who are doing things wrong and try to advocate for things to be done well as another source of something else on our to-do list. So I would love to hear all of you talk about like tangible things that all of us could be doing besides, as you've been saying so eloquently, following our interests and doing our own research. But what other tangible things are needed by us to help with existing projects or things like that?
We're going to have so much to say on that. Well, first of all, I'm going to just a few statistics. 2014-15 season, if you look at the amount of pieces played by the top 22 U.S. orchestras, a study by Baltimore Symphony showed that it was under 2% of women composers that were being performed. 2%. And this was, right before the Me Too movement. As soon as you see that Me Too movement, it goes up to about 8%, and we've never gone over that. It's been hovering there ever since. And for us to uncover one of these works, to get them played, the first step is if you actually see a piece by Lily Boulanger being performed by an orchestra, you write to that orchestra and you say, I loved this, I will come again if you program another work by, or show that you're supportive. If you have $1 to donate, do that with that voice, and they will see that even more. So making sure that they hear us and that they know that we are coming to those concerts for those reasons, because we want to hear these works performed that have never been performed before. As far as volunteers, we all need volunteers. We have a huge, robust internship for our marketing teams and our finance teams and our business management teams and the research team. We always have a ton of interns for that, and those interns become volunteers for life. We don't ever see anybody walk away. They get addicted to this kind of work, and we take them to Wikathons and update those Wikipedia pages. And we've just started a new program called Redefining the Canon, which updates orchestral excerpts, audition excerpts. So there's a way to sign up for that. And if you are a tuba player, we will send you part of a tuba part from one of these historical pieces, and you can go in and, like a mushroom forager, forage out those 12 measures that do the exact same thing as that Mozart score, and we can just swap those out. And then orchestral partners get a list. If they have a tuba audition coming up, we will send them a list of all of these options of pieces that they can swap out. So there's a million ways to get involved.
If I could, I wanted to speak about scholarship, which Rachel Barton-Pine was talking about, and it's something I'm so passionate about. And you need to be in these archival libraries to know when you get a published score, right? When you get a piece by Florence Price, or you get a piece by any marginalized composer, and you're looking at it, and it does not quite add up to what you just saw in the library, which is their handwritten, their creative ideas, right? There's so much information being put at us right now today because we're trying to do something to help everything that has been 400 years in, more of disparity and racism. And when you do something so quickly, you have to ask yourself, would you do this to Bach? Would you do this to Beethoven? Would you be so careless and not write the same notes that Bach wrote? No, that would be blasphemous. Like, you would not do that. But it is happening so much. And so that's why I say the database is the entry point. But I look at my scores as the entry point too. And we need to, yes, we have to look at all of the information that we're given and ask. I love Melanie's mind. I wish I had her mind. And ask those questions. right? Just because you have something in your hand or a quick Google or a database, know that you're just coming to phase one. If you want the full story, Jennifer Snow, I love her, she's always talked about the full story, right? If you want that full story, you need to start at the library. That's part one that you need to be at. So I say this to all of us because so many of us are performers as well, and if we are performing this work, I really, really feel that if we're going to continue this scholarship in the highest way, in the most, in a way of integrity, we need to be advancing the scholarship in the same way that we would do with any other composer that is continuously played in our concert halls.
Read. Question. And listen. Read, question, and listen. What we're doing here is very similar to, and thank you, Rachel. Did Rachel take off? There she is. I want to thank Rachel for bringing up the name Dominic Rene Delermo, preeminent musicologist and librarian. When Dominic Rene Delermo was working in Oklahoma, he was inspired by the work of T.J. Anderson. Some of you may know Dr. Anderson, composer, now a nonagenarian. And Dominic Rene Delermo had been very invested, I believe, in the work of Stravinsky, musicologist, librarian. And he becomes interested in answering reference questions about Black music research when he gets to Indiana University on he discovers that there's not much, it's very difficult for him to answer reference questions. The same kind of things these databases answer. He had a reference question on April the 5th of 1968. And it was questioned to him, I need a string quartet by a Black composer, and I need it by 12 noon for the Berkshire String Quartet to play at Martin Luther King's celebration of life, but also immediate session of coming together for the Indiana University campus. And from that point forward, until his passing, Dominic Rene Delermo went on to write maybe 1,500 documents about all these historical composers. And you can look at the trajectory of his writing, his listening, his production of program notes, his ability to help bring people together, to come together from all vocational walks of life, meaning whatever you do with your life, the ideas, the mission is what undergirds our shared progress. And what he did in 1969, 70, 71, and 72 is he brought together a number of people, most notably Mrs. Johnny V. Lee, T.J. Anderson, and Undine Smith Moore. And they talked about the rigor with which you would approach Bach. You can do that with these other composers. Now that was a long time ago. And in 1996, Lucius Wyatt from Prairie View A&M said the exact same thing in the Black Music Research Journal when they did a full issue on pedagogical techniques. It's not to replace the canon. It's to infuse. It's to restore the full, comprehensive, holistic truth. And that does start in the library, but it also is rooted in reading, nourishing your brain, knowing as much as you can, because each one of you has the power to become an informational liaison, a steward for these resources in your community. I don't play anymore, but I read. And I really listen to what people have to say, because I know when I walk out of here, this notebook, I'm just gonna start writing and listening and questioning, because you might see something and it might not be quite accurate. Don't forget, it took 150 years to, shall we say, restore Chevalier de Saint George's historical truths from 1840, when a book was written about him in the French Romantic style, where a lot of elaborative, whimsical stylistics infused into that narrative. And it took 150 years before a real biography, also in the Black Music Research Journal, was printed. That's 150 years. It's a long time. But people never gave up. Dominic René Lerma was very invested in restoring Chevalier. Gabriel Bonat, who, by the way, was first and foremost a performer. He was a violinist at the New York Philharmonic. Rachel's work has been multiple decades of getting this not only from the library, but into the ears of people. So if you find yourself in a transitional stage in your careers, at a stopping point, if you are interested but don't have the financial capital to do programming, remember, you have the power to read. You have the power to question, you have the power to listen, and you have the power to use your human resources to ensure that you are the strongest advocate that information has to make you be.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we probably have time for maybe just, yep, I got the sign. one more question. But we will be here, I think, 10, 15 minutes after this panel, and we have to sort of swap out. I should say, Boulanger Initiative, Castle of Our Skins, and also Decomposed, who is also here. We are tabling on the 4th floor, so you can come find us and connect. Throughout the conference, please do continue to connect and have these conversations. But let's take one more question.
Thank you so much. My name is Javier Leon. I'm the director of the Latin American Music Center at Indiana University. And just wanted to thank you for all the things you're doing. Our center deals with very much a lot of the same issues that you've been talking about. And one of the things I just kind of wanted to ask you is, so over time, archives like ours, the different projects that you have kind of worked really hard and also collaborated with individuals, academics, to kind of create basically an alternate knowledge network to kind of like the mainstream, the mainstream places where musicological knowledge gets distributed about, classical composers. And I think we are at a moment where a lot of these projects are beginning to get a lot more attention. They're beginning to kind of collaborate with one another. There's this, this kind of coordinating that is kind of beginning to happen. But the thing that still kind of keeps me up at night is that it seems like all of these projects, there's this huge amount of burden placed on the institutions and the scholars and the musicians kind of interested in wanting to do that work that does not get acknowledged, and that is part of the reason why there are still kind of barriers that allows all of these fantastic collections, all of the works of these archives to kind of get completely infused into kind of the mainstream. Lately we've been getting a lot of interest for programming Latin American and Latin A composers, for example. So we get requests from orchestras or sometimes from solo performers. And the idea is like, okay, could you tell me what are the top 10 best oboe pieces, from Latin American composers? I said, well, we have a database. I can give you, 80 of them, but I'm not an oboe player. You're actually going to have to look through them, play them, decide what works for you, decide what are the kind of jewels in the crown. And if you're talking with somebody who, with a BICOP performer about that, they will dive in, they will do the work, that will lead to recordings. If you are getting somebody who is more recently coming to the idea because they want to be more inclusive in the repertoire, usually but the answer would be, well, that's just too much work, and they will just kind of walk away. Or if they, if our collections are not as thoroughly vetted and the finding is because of lack of resources, people will walk away. And so the question is, how do we get to a point where we get other people to realize that part of the obligation that needs to exist in order for that repertoire to kind of infuse the main canon is that it takes more work. And that in fact, the people who should be doing that work are the groups of people who have systematically, over generations, have kept that work out from that kind of mainstream. So I don't know if you have any, I'm trying to figure out strategies of getting that message across diplomatically, because you do want people to come back. So I would love any insights that you might have.
We have probably negative seconds here, but I want to pinpoint Laura because I know you not only have created this database, but you have an entire ecosystem around the database and its application. And maybe that could be a point of conversation that we can
Yeah,
jump
with
in. But
negative seconds, I'm happy to talk afterwards with you, but we have a consulting service, so we see the database as our library, and we are the librarians, the stewards, who can take that information farther and help you on that journey. So trying to figure out, we have a consultation call for anybody who's interested, and we can figure out what the jumping point is to start the conversation, to get that person to go down the rabbit hole in their own way, what their path might be. And then our virtual workshops and those kinds of things kind of take the conversation to a different level, whether it's about a specific composer or updating Wikipedia pages for composers, those kinds of things. And you can always find some kind of path, and people have to be willing to spend the time. And curriculum, yeah, for sure, taking these programs to schools and really starting at a young age to get them curious, and so that the next generation doesn't have this issue. They're already growing up with this knowledge and the tools to be able to do this themselves.
We need hours, I'm sure. I can already sense so. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but again, we'll be here for the next maybe 10, 15 minutes before we change over, and then please do find us throughout the conference. Melanie had referenced on Hopin, we have, as well as some QR codes if we can get those out to scan, some references, some resources, some selected bibliographies for you to be able to engage with. So please do, on Hopin, check out that link, and if you need anything else, again, we're all here and passionate, as you can see, to engage in this kind of work. So thank you again for joining, both virtually and online.